Anyway, what she did was she gave me a pile of insurance policies.
Okay.
And she gave me a pile of leases.
Mm-hmm.
She said, I want you to work out which of these tenants don't have to pay their rent because of COVID-19.
Yeah, such an interesting question. And I think there's going to be a lot of litigation about it, potentially. Really important and interesting.
Yeah. So on the insurance policies, it was so interesting to look into how the diseases were defined. Sometimes just notifiable diseases, sometimes infectious diseases. And sometimes there was a list of diseases, which of course never included COVID-19.
It's a bit too new for all that, isn't it? Yeah.
So that was a really interesting aspect of the insurance policy. Another interesting aspect of the insurance policy was the meaning of damage to premises and the use of that term throughout.
Mm. But did you find clauses that you thought, yeah, you know, a landlord could claim under this policy for COVID-19?
Yeah. There was one that I had which said that if there was a notifiable disease, an outbreak of which the local authority had stipulated was a notifiable disease, was manifested by someone either in the premises or within 25 miles of it with that disease.
Now that might be tricky, given that we haven't had much testing.
That's true. But I said to the client, I said, all we need is a hospital within 25 miles of the premises and we should be okay. What else have you seen within the policies?
Yeah, because COVID-19 is a notifiable disease, isn't it? It is a notifiable disease. And I think there are also quite useful clauses sometimes about government actions, shutting down premises. That might be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, there's three questions I get all the time. The first one is about duty to mitigate, whether the landlord's got a duty to mitigate before it can claim under the insurance policy.
I can't see how it can, because, you know, in a well-drafted lease, the rent cesser clause, which says the tenant no longer has to pay rent, should be linked to the insured risk, shouldn't it?
Yeah.
So if you've got a nice broad insured risk definition in the lease, like the landlord can insure, he must insure against, you know, fire, storm, etc., and such other risks it thinks appropriate, then if the landlord has in fact taken out that insurance, it should be an insured risk under the lease. And if properly drafted, that will mean that the rent cesser will kick in, and then the tenant's not obliged to pay rent. So it's got a complete defence. So I don't see how there's anything that the landlord can mitigate.
Yeah.
It doesn't have a right to sue the tenant for rent, does it?
I agree with that completely, yeah. Unless there's a contractual clause that requires it to take certain steps as a precondition to a claim, possibly.
It needs to be checked, obviously, yeah, sure.
Second question I get is, what happens if the tenant has already paid its rent? Can it reclaim it back if it finds through us going through these insurance policies and leases that in fact it didn't have to pay?
Yeah, I thought it must be able to, surely, as a mistake. Yeah. I mean, if a tenant has paid the March quarter and when it looks at it, it realises that it wasn't liable under its lease for the March quarter, because by that time we already had regulations in place that were shutting down premises, surely that's a mistake of fact or law that would enable the tenant to recover.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, the landlord's going to say, well, where's the mistake? You were contractually obliged under the lease to pay the March quarter day rent. You paid the March quarter day thinking you were paying the March quarter day rent. Where's the mistake? Yeah,
but isn't the mistake because the tenant doesn't know at that stage that they have a good defence to the payment of rent, that the rent cesser clause has kicked in? Perhaps because they haven't been shown the policy.
Yeah.
A lot of tenants don't see the insurance policies, do they?
Even though they've paid for it.
Even though they've paid for it.
I mean, that's the big fact here, isn't it? The big fact here is that the tenant is paying for the policy. Yeah. And therefore the tenant should be able to use the benefit of that policy through the rent cesser provision to avoid having to pay its rent if it turns out that the way it segues with the policy means that no rent's payable because it's insured.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the way it should work. Yeah. So if there's insurance cover for the landlord, then it should be for the benefit of the tenant in the rent cesser. Yeah. If everything is drafted properly. Yeah.
The third question I get is easy. The third question I get is, can the insurer be subrogated to the landlord and claim the rent from the tenant?
I don't see how the insurer can have any subrogation rights, do you? Because subrogation just means that the insurer steps into the landlord's shoes, but if the landlord doesn't have any claim against the tenant because it's contractually agreed that rent is not payable, then the insurer's got nothing to enforce against the tenant.
Yeah. So what I'm telling tenants now is get the policy. You paid for the policy. Get that policy. Check the policy against the rent cesser provision, and be satisfied that it doesn't mean that you don't have to pay the rent before you pay any more rent. That's my advice to tenants.
Yeah, I actually think it's landlords who really, really need to be thinking about this now, because the real risk for a landlord is that the rent cesser provision in the lease has kicked in and the tenant is not liable, or may even be able to reclaim rent that it's already paid, but the landlord loses out in terms of covering that through its insurance. So the risk is, for example, that the landlord hasn't notified the circumstances in sufficient time because it's busy pursuing the tenant, and it hasn't taken the action it needs to under the insurance policy. And that would be a real disaster zone, wouldn't it? That the tenant can say, I'm no longer liable to pay rent, or I can get my rent back, and the landlord can't claim it under the insurance policy.
Yeah. And landlords should know, of course, that the FCA have issued pretty strict advice that insurers need to deal with these claims quickly and make interim payments in order to oil the wheels.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll see. I mean, the insurance industry isn't well known for coughing up cash, is it, quickly? So I think you've got to imagine that quite a number of them will be denying that there's any cover, even if it seems pretty clear that there is.
Yeah. Anyway, we will discuss this more next week. We're doing a virtual in-house seminar to a firm, and we will discuss the detail of this, perhaps by reference to some specific clauses together ahead of that, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's good.
Keep under your hat what I mentioned to you before.
Will do.
Okay. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. Bye.